The note in here that says, it was noted in the fiscal and policy note of the Safe to Learn Act that the Carroll County would need a total of 26 dedicated deputies to meet the adequate coverage requirement. And I have to admit that statement jumps off the page at me. I'm trying to understand, if we know there's a lot of, they haven't defined yet what adequate coverage means, and I'd like to understand how they could make who made this assessment, how could they make that sort of assessment if they don't even know what adequate coverage really means. And I'd like to understand whether we think, I believe we thought that our coverage has been adequate all along through Adopt a School. So I think that we're potentially setting unreasonable expectations or defining the situation unrealistically.
So just a tad bit of legislative history. What became this law initially started as 3 separate bills. One bill was essentially to require every school, every public school in Maryland to have an SRO assigned to it. That eventually became what you see in this law, modified, amended. And so when the Department of Legislative Services, which is the organization that does that analysis, looked at the law as rewritten or as amended into one big law and said, okay, what does that mean? And when you hear Ed Clark from Center for School Safety make public presentations at the State Board and other places and say the law doesn't require an SRO in every school, that's less in reaction to Carroll County, which is the only school system in Maryland today who doesn't have an existing SRO program, and more in reaction to other school systems that do have an SRO program but don't have an SRO assigned to every single school. And this is a generalization, but generally systems that have had an SRO program for many years have typically an SRO per high school, sometimes per high school and nearby middle school, but maybe generally one per high school. And then other SROs that maybe do a middle school and a couple of feeder elementary schools, or schools that are arranged to make sense geographically. So there's not a 1-to-1 ratio, but every school has coverage. They're assigned that way. So then when you look at us, there's really no way to equate us and what adequate coverage would mean for us to kind of that model. And so the amendments that took place were very carefully constructed so that a place like Baltimore County that has hundreds of schools or even other larger systems don't have to suddenly have all of these new SROs to fill every single school 1-to-1. They would have adequate coverage under the model that they're working under. In our case, we had none. We had police engagement and police coverage, Adopt a School and other things, but we didn't have this more formalized program. So when DLS looked at us, they said, okay, we'll apply basically that model that exists elsewhere here. In year one deputy per high school, and then in year 2, they used roughly, I think, 1 per 2 or 3. I don't know if you remember.
They used the clustering kind of formula.
But I think it was 1 per 2 or 3 schools, and came up with the FTE total of 26. And they're applying that existing model to a place that has never had that model, and that's how they arrived at that. And the county got close to that number, I think, over a 2-year phase-in. 24? 20. So they're very close to that, and the sheriff would have to figure out with resources how to apply that coverage. I'll say this because I don't know that Dwayne would. I don't know that I would highly doubt that we will get a legal definition of adequate coverage out of MCSS or the State Board or anybody else. You'll do the annual reports that are required, and you'll get feedback on how they feel about your coverage pattern through that process. But that's what that policy fiscal note relates to, I think.
So the 26 wasn't meant to be an additional number of deputies that's needed. It was meant to be that's how many it would take. You have some, I mean, we do have a police presence in our schools, so clearly it's not
26.
26. Yeah. I mean, we do have some coverage and the roles and responsibilities. So the Adopt a School, I don't know how.
True, but I do think they meant kind of full time during the school day. Not 1-to-1, but I'm in that coverage region for these 2 or 3 schools during the hours of school. The sheriff doesn't have that capacity now. He has to patrol roads. He has to patrol all corners of the county. He has to leave to respond to whatever or not go to the school because of whatever's happening. The intent of this law is to have that coverage during the school days, during the hours of school. And so I don't want to speak too much for the sheriff, but I don't know how he would pull that off without the additional resources. And I think that's what DLS was getting at.
Okay.